Welcome to the training module for the Value Stack Calculator, version 3.0 update. My name is Andrew Solfest, and I'm a consultant from Energy and Environmental Economics, supporting the development and maintenance of the Value Stack Calculator in partnership with NYSERDA. Throughout this training, I may also refer to the calculator as the Value of Distributed Energy Resources, or VDER calculator. Before we begin, I want to briefly provide context around the value stack and this calculator. In 2017, the New York Public Service Commission established the value stack methodology to compensate distributed energy resources, or DERs, for energy they provide to the grid. The value stack is a nuanced tariff structure which values generation based on both when and where it is injected to the grid. In order to help project developers better understand the value stack and to estimate expected project revenue under this tariff, NYSERDA and E3 developed an Excel-based tool, the Value Stack Calculator. This calculator is available in two different versions. The Phase 1 version is intended for projects that qualified for the value stack on or before July 26, 2018. The Phase 2 version is for those that have qualified since. In some earlier iterations, you may see the Phase 1 version referred to as the legacy version, and the Phase 2 version referred to as the new order version. A prior training presentation for the Value Stack Calculator from 2019 is available on NYSERDA's website on the NYSERDA Value Stack Resources page, and this is still a useful resource for new users. Today's presentation is intended as a supplementary update to accompany the Value Stack Calculator Phase 2 version 3.0 and later editions. The Phase 2 version 3.0 includes several updates which will be detailed later in the presentation. One key update is that the version 3.0 merges the Solar Value Stack Calculator with the Standalone Storage Calculator, allowing users to estimate revenue for either type of project within a single calculator file. Please note that this update only applies for the Phase 2 version and not the Phase 1 version of the calculator. In this training, we will begin with a recap of the value stack, including its components and other resources that are available to users. We will provide an overview of the value stack calculator itself and highlight the updates made for version 3.0, then walk through 4 examples using the calculator to model different types of DER projects. By the end of this training, the goal is for users to be familiar with the broad elements of the value stack and able to use the value stack calculator on their own for a variety of project types. As a disclaimer, the value stack calculator is intended only to help developers understand the value stack tariff and estimate revenues. These estimations are not guaranteed by NYSERDA, and the actual project revenue will be determined by the utilities as the project operates. Calculator results are heavily dependent on user inputs, while actual project revenue will vary depending on factors such as weather and future market rates. As mentioned earlier, the value stack is used to determine the value of energy supplied to the electrical grid by distributed energy resources, or DERs. Compensation for some DERs was previously based on a net metering structure, but the value stack has gradually replaced that as a means to more clearly align the payments to DER project owners with the actual benefits they're providing to the grid. Where the net metering structure recognized energy value in volumetric per kilowatt-hour credits, the value stack instead provides customers with monetary or dollar-based credits on their electricity bills. Each individual benefit provided by DERs is recognized as a separate component. Together, they make up the value stack. Projects may be eligible for different combinations of value stack components, depending on the nature of the technology they include and their ability to address specific grid needs. Value stack components include energy, capacity, environmental, demand reduction, and locational system relief values, as well as either a market transition or community credit specific to community distributed generation projects. The energy value, or locational-based marginal price, is available to all projects and is based on the New York Independent System Operator, or NYSO, day-ahead hourly wholesale rates for energy. The capacity value, also known as ICAP, is also available to all projects and represents how well a project can meet or reduce the statewide peak energy consumption. There are three different payment options known as alternatives 1, 2, and 3. Solar projects may choose from alternative 1, which provides a small credit for each kilowatt hour produced throughout the year, alternative 2, which provides a payment based on output during a summertime peak window, or alternative 3, which provides compensation based on output during the year's single statewide peak load hour. Standalone storage projects must take alternative 3. More information on the alternatives is available on the NYSERDA Value Stack website, specifically the FAQs page. The environmental benefit, also referred to as the E value of a project, is available to projects producing clean energy from renewable resources. Solar photovoltaic, or PV projects, and paired PV and storage projects, where the storage is charged exclusively by the solar, qualify for the E value. Standalone storage which charges from the grid is not eligible for the E value. Environmental value rates are locked in on a per kilowatt hour basis for 25 years, and projects may elect to forego this compensation in favor of retaining non-tradable renewable energy certificates, or RECs, for the energy they produce. The environmental value component can be thought of as a payment for selling the REC to the utility. Demand reduction value, or DRV, is available to all projects and is provided based on a project's ability to reduce net demand on a utility's distribution grid during the peak window. Locational system relief value is a component only available to certain projects in key utility load pockets and is paid out based on the minimum hourly kilowatt value of energy that projects can inject into the grid during 10 or more call events during the year. To receive this value, projects must be available to provide energy during those call events. Finally, the market transition credit was available to the community distributed generation projects under the Phase 1 tariff as a replacement for the DRV. Under the Phase 2 tariff, which is the focus of this training presentation, these projects instead may receive the community credit in addition to the normal DRV component. In addition to this value stack calculator, NYSERDA hosts a variety of other resources on its website. The link to this page is displayed on the slide and can be found either via searching NYSERDA Value Stack Resources in any search engine or by going to the NYSUN website and navigating to the Contractors page and then the Value Stack. These resources include links to prior and current value stack orders, summary presentations or webinar recordings, such as this training, a list of answers to frequently asked questions, updates to incentive tranches and their availability, links to monthly utility filings, and other VEDR order source documents. The webpage specific to the value stack calculator is found at the link displayed on this slide and includes versions of the calculator for both Phase 1 or Phase 2 qualifying projects, as well as notes on revisions made and an option to sign up for email notifications of future updates. So, what exactly is the value stack calculator and what does it do? The calculator is a free Excel-based model developed as a joint effort by E3 and NYSERDA, which answers the question, what is the estimated value of energy produced by my solar or storage system? It provides explanations of each of the value stack components, documents data sources used to estimate project values, and after calculating expected revenues based on those user inputs, also includes visualization, the results. The calculator is updated periodically to address revisions to the value stack tariff and incorporate new available utility and market data. As mentioned earlier, the calculator has both Phase 1 and Phase 2 versions, which are applicable depending on when a project is or was installed. As of Phase 2 version 3.0, the Phase 2 calculator is now also able to evaluate front-of-the-meter standalone storage projects. Previously, there is a separate edition of the value stack calculator specific to standalone storage projects, and the Phase 2 calculator could only be used for projects including solar. Going forward, in the Phase 2 version, users will be able to select their project type and the applicable rate or other relevant details in order to estimate both revenues and charging costs for either solar, solar plus storage, or standalone storage systems. Users should note that this update does not apply to the legacy Phase 1 version of the calculator, so that will still be intended for use only with solar or solar plus storage projects. It is also important for users to understand what the value stack calculator is not. The calculator is not a full pro forma for an individual project. It does not account for project costs, incentives or tax credits, contract structures between developers and DER owners for community subscribers, or anything else that isn't explicitly a part of the value stack itself. The calculator is also not a guarantee of future project revenue. This is only a forward-looking estimate, and actual bill credits or revenue from a project will be calculated by the relevant utility as a project is operating. The calculator is also not intended to be used for behind-the-meter storage projects. The major change in the version 3.0 update is the merging functionality of the previous separate standalone storage calculator into the solar value stack calculator. For users familiar with the solar value stack calculator, existing model inputs are largely unchanged, though have been reorganized in an effort to improve process flow while accommodating the new inputs needed for standalone storage projects. There is now an additional dispatch module specific to standalone storage, which incorporates utility retail rates in order to calculate charging costs and optimize storage charging and discharging at a basic level. The model logic for generation and discharge of solar or solar plus storage projects remains unchanged from the prior version. On the back end of the model, calculation flows have been modified slightly so that an updated storage tab will summarize results of either solar plus storage or standalone storage modules. Model outputs have been added for the charging costs and revenues of standalone storage, and the data visualization has also been updated. Finally, the documentation tab and input notes now address standalone storage inputs and eligibility for different value stack components. Additionally, the revision 3.0 pulls in the most recent available energy capacity and LSRV schedule data as part of the regular update cycle. Here, you can see a list of tabs within the value stack calculator and some additional notes on the updates made. Tabs in blue are those which existed in the prior version of the calculator, while the green tabs are new additions. In updating the calculator, we have focused primarily on maintaining the familiar user interface and functionality as closely as possible. The calculator provides nuanced modeling of the storage dispatch for both solar plus storage and standalone storage projects, and recognizes the difference in value stack eligibility between project types. In adding in the retail rate section for standalone storage, we have also expanded this to include a larger selection of rates from multiple utilities than were available in either the prior standalone storage or solar calculators. Dive into some sample model runs. Here are a few tips to keep in mind when using the model. The Documentation tab is a key resource. Read it over carefully before using the calculator, or if you have questions on any inputs. The first input in the model, the project type dropdown, is the most important. Make sure you've selected the right option, or else the full set of inputs for your project will not be available, and some inputs that do show may not make sense. If hoping to obtain revenue from components such as the LSRV or CSRP, first double-check eligibility and utility filings are on their websites. Several of these sources are linked in the Documentation tab of the calculator, and we have included a link to the CSRP map on this slide. If looking at an on-site behind-the-meter project, keep in mind how on-site projects work. Energy consumed on-site offsets retail purchases, so you should know and make sure you're entering the correct retail rate. Any excess energy generated and output to the electrical grid would be compensated based on the value stack. The calculator estimates project revenue, but they may not be the same as developers' revenue, so keep that in mind when using the calculator. When entering inputs, you should also consider whether you want an optimistic, a conservative, or a best guess estimate of revenue. Think very carefully about any rate escalators you use. They compound a great deal over a 25-year cash flow. As with anything, but especially important in a model with as many inputs as this calculator, be sure to double check each of your inputs and that they're in the correct units if applicable. If you're uncertain of what inputs mean, look to the notes on the right-hand side of the User Inputs tab or to the Documentation tab for help. To be extra confident in your results, it may also be worth checking out the NYSERDA website resources or actual orders themselves. If you have any questions about the calculator or inputs for a project that are not addressed within the calculator documentation or the other resources available online, you can send them to veeder@nyserda.ny.gov. If you have more general policy questions about the value stack, you can send them to veeder@dps.ny.gov. Finally, if you want to dig in further to the calculator to understand specific formulas and calculations, the password to unlock the calculator is NYSUN. We will now walk through actually using the calculator and look at 4 different example projects. This section will show how a user can select inputs for each project type and where to view the relevant results. We'll try to cover a broad range of scenarios, including community distributed generation, remote crediting with solar plus storage, behind-the-meter solar with on-site load, and the new addition of standalone storage. As I open the model, I want to call out a few things. First, when you download the file, you might see a banner across the top stating that the file is downloaded from the internet and asking if you want to be able to edit anyway. You'll want to select yes if that pops up. You might also see a banner asking if you want to enable macros. You don't necessarily need to enable macros if you're not planning to use the storage degradation function that we'll discuss later. But if you do want that functionality, you'll want to enable content. If you instead see a red banner stating that the macros are disabled automatically, you'll either want to go into Excel Options, Trust Center, and enable macros in your settings for just this file, or else set up a trusted folder that you can move the file into where macros can be enabled. Before we actually go into the model ones, I do want to briefly walk through the tabs. First, we have the cover page, which describes the purpose of this calculator and each of the subsequent tabs. I'd recommend reading through this before using the calculator. Next is the User Inputs tab, which we'll walk through in depth in the model runs. Then there are two Outputs tabs. Summary Outputs provides a very high-level overview of annual results for the project. And then Detailed Outputs provides more granularity of those results. In this revision 3.0, in addition to adding outputs relevant to standalone storage, we've updated some of the graphs provided, which we'll also go over in the model runs. I do want to note now that not all of these graphs will populate every time you run the model, depending on the type of project you're modeling. The Documentation tab is a key resource providing definitions of calculator inputs and value stack components, along with a description of how the inputs are used in the backend logic. This is the first place to go if you have questions about what to enter or why the results you're seeing look the way they do. And this tab is split up by the type of project and specific uses, starting with the value stack components, then walking through the different inputs. Also about a dozen additional tabs, including one for each value stack component, which don't require any input or action from the user, but do include other data updated by NYSERDA and E3 each year, and the actual calculations for the model. The way the calculator is designed, you don't need to know how all of these work in order to use the calculator, but they are there in case you're interested. One thing that is important to note is that this updated version 3.0 is that the few storage-related tabs here are set up not protected by default, meaning that you don't need the password to go in and alter anything. This is because of the storage degradation macro, which I'll talk about later, and needs to be able to make changes to these tabs. But it also means that users do need to be careful not to accidentally edit these tabs themselves. The other calculation tabs are protected by default, but it is possible to unlock these tabs with the password NYSUN, all lowercase, if desired. In the first example, we'll look at a front-of-the-meter community solar project. We'll see how the compensation calculation changes if we change from a fixed tilt project with ICAP alternative 1 to a tracking array with ICAP alternative 2. So let's dive back into the calculator in the User Inputs tab. The calculator can take a few seconds to update after each input is selected, so I went ahead and pre-selected each of the inputs before recording my screen. I also happen to have Excel formulas set to calculate manually, you can see here on the bottom. This is just a personal preference and not necessary, but if you do go with that option, you'll want to make sure you're clicking Calculate in Excel after setting all the inputs and before actually clicking on the gray Calculate macro button. For anyone that has used a calculator before, this should look pretty familiar, but we have made a few updates with this revision, mostly to support increased functionality with the ability to model standalone storage. The other updates are simply rearranging inputs, so it's hopefully a little more intuitive to align inputs with the specific project type. One of the changes to pay attention to is the addition of several gray formatted cells like this one. These are those cells updated or overwritten by formulas which the user should not be changing. Some of these are entirely new to support functional updates, and others simply make more visible to the user some of the calculations that were previously hidden. Walking through this first example, we're going to be looking at a community distribution generation project. You'll always want to start out by entering the project type, which is solar here, and the interconnection limit, which we're going to max out in this case at 5,000 kilowatts AC. Next, we'll want to enter the utility and the NYSO zone. New York is split up into 11 different zones, which impact the energy price received. You can look up a map of the NYSO zones online, or there's a link in the documentation tab to see which your project is located in. Now, something else that's moved from the prior versions is the financial analysis specifications. These are not new, but used to be lower on the Inputs tab and are now grouped at the top. You'll just need to enter the project start year, analysis period, and your choice of inflation and nominal discount rates. Because we selected solar as the project type, you'll see that this is already indicated in gray, in this gray calculated cell in the solar project input section. We don't want to touch any of these gray cells. Community distributed generation projects at times have been eligible to receive a community credit, which differentiated them from remote crediting systems. However, as of the time of recording this, the community credit is not available. So I'm going to go ahead and select not applicable here. Now we'll go through and populate characteristics for the solar system and site itself. You can either choose to input your own solar profile over at the right here, or you can go through and use one already in the calculator. We're going to go with the latter just to make things easy. We're modeling, or the closest location here is Albany, so we're going to start by modeling a fixed tilt system facing due south. It's 180-degree azimuth. We're modeling a 700 or 7,500 kilowatt DC system, but the max AC system size is still 5 megawatts or 5,000 kilowatts. I'm going to use the recommended defaults that are suggested here for the inverter and system losses. And if we scroll down, we'll assume a 0.5% degradation in exports over time, and just to simplify things, no parasitic loads. Because this is a solar-only project, the storage section, which follows, is all grayed out for us. For the compensation inputs, we'll assume we are not in an LSRV zone, though if we were, I'd recommend just using the current LSRV rate option listed here. For DRV, under the Phase 2 rules, community solar projects can receive the DRV, so I'm going to be on the optimistic side and say we'll receive the current DRV rate for all years of the project. For the energy rate, the LVMP, we have 3 years of historic rates built into the calculator, so I'm going to make use of all of those, the 36-month average in this case. So you could also just select to use the last 1 or 2 years, or even input your own, again, to the right. I'm going to assume 2% escalation, including inflation in that number. For the capacity value, I'm going to, again, take the most recent 3 years and select alternative 1. Some of the minor updates included in the version 3.0 include some additional callouts and documentation. You can see here there's a note popping up. You hover over the capacity cell, you can see a little more detail on the rate options. You can see the ICAP zone was already automatically selected for me in a gray cell, so I don't need to do anything to change that. For system loss factors, I'm going to leave these as total transmission and distribution, but if you want to adjust these, you can see what the assumed losses for each type are on the losses tab of the calculator, just to give it a little more detail. For the environmental value, I'm going to leave this as is. The calculator has the most recently published social cost of carbon from DPS in here, so I'll leave this at the default. Finally, the last inputs relate to customer bill savings. I'm assuming no on-site consumption or parasitic load, so we will set the other values to 0. And go ahead and click on the calculate button. Just takes a few seconds to complete. It says see outputs tab for results. I'm going to move over there. On the Summary Outputs tab, we will see an annual breakdown of the estimated value of the system. Given our inputs, we're estimating that the system will generate just upward of $1 million of revenue, or in this case, bill credits for community distributed generation each year. The outputs provide a breakdown of the energy flows for solar-only projects. You can see here. That just means generation that is exported to the system, which we have decreasing slightly each year based on the solar degradation we input. The value of energy produced still increases because it's in nominal dollars, and we had that 2% escalation rate. Note that in this version 3.0, there are two different average project value lines here. One applicable for projects including solar, based on the kilowatt hours of energy generated, and another that would be for standalone storage projects looking at net compensation for exports. Cover that when we get to the standalone storage example. Below, you can see a nice and pretty straightforward graph showing the nominal value of compensation over time. Everything here is coming from solar directly exported, so we just have the orange bars in this model run. On the Detailed Outputs tab, we can see all the information feeding into this. At the top, we have a monthly breakdown of estimated generation and compensation, also laying out how much value is coming from each component of the value stack. The largest component here is the energy value, or LBMP, and you'll notice that, for example, the demand reduction value is only applied in summer months, while we have selected to assume no locational system relief value at all. We are modeling no on-site or parasitic load, so this next section is empty, as are the storage inputs. If we scroll down further, the project doesn't have any generation prior to the value stack. And then we get back to the annual compensation section, again broken out by value stack component. At the very bottom of this, you can see a net present value of the project and a series of figures or graphs. Several of these are new, and they can have a few different elements, so I just want to walk through them briefly. For the first two and the last two charts, the user can select a specific period to show the data for, and we're going to look at the export behavior of a summer day. You can see in this case with the solar-only system, that the solar PV generation lines right up with the solar being exported to the grid. The shape can differ a little for the other project types, and for standalone storage, you won't see this because there is no solar generation. To the right of the charts, you can see a notes section, which I won't read through one by one, but do provide some additional explanation of the graphs. The second chart shows a snapshot of a specific day. You'll notice this one is a little more irregular, because while the previous chart was an average across weekdays in a month, this one shows an individual day modeled from the historical solar profiles we have. We cannot predict exact behavior any more than the weather that impacts it, but this chart is intended to be illustrative of a simulated theoretical day. The third chart shows energy flows across months of the first project year, instead of for the hours within a given day. For a solar-only system, this will align with the solar profiles input in the model. The next chart here shows charging costs, if applicable, and compensation from exports, either as revenue or bill reductions. This is again across each month of the year, but the user can select which year they want to view, and the scale may adjust accordingly. Finally, the most colorful chart we have here will look pretty similar to the prior one, but instead illustrates where all that money comes from by value stack component. As we noted earlier, you can see energy makes up the largest share, though DRV pulls a good share of weight in the midsummer months. So we've now completed our first model run, but I also want to compare that to what the results would look like if we took the same system size and location, but made it single axis tracking and opted for the ICAP alternative 2. So, go back. make the changes here. Change the alternative 2. And then click Calculate again. For a side-by-side comparison, we can look at the detailed outputs that come up on the next slide. Looking at this comparison with screenshots of the results, we can see a few things have changed. The solar generation has increased overall with the use of a single-axis tracking system, especially in the summer months. Generation happens to have decreased slightly in the winter months, just as a quirk of the solar profile data available for this location. But overall, we still see an increase, resulting in higher compensation from energy value. By moving from ICAP alternative 1 to alternative 2, we can see that the change to the capacity crediting has shifted, so that instead of a steady stream of capacity values throughout the year, they're heavily concentrated in the summer months, with no value assigned to the winter. Overall, the total values of the system has increased. I've pulled the results here from the Summary tab, but you can see that the net present value of the project goes from just under $13 million to a little over $14 million. For a second example, we'll look at a front-of-the-meter remote crediting solar project. You'll see how the compensation changes if we add battery storage. So, jumping back to the user inputs, I have another copy of the model set up for remote crediting in Con Edison territory. We'll start with this project as solar only and say it's in zone I. Set the interconnection limit to 800 kilowatts AC. This time, instead of a community distributed generation project, we'll select remote crediting. However, because we didn't actually apply the community credit or older market transition credit to the community distributed generation example, value stack eligibility in this instance will actually be very similar. For the system details, we'll say it's closest to New York City with a 1 megawatt DC size, 800 kilowatt AC system that is fixed and south facing. The on-site load option will set to 0 so we can disregard the load shape inputs. We'll assume again that it's not in an LSRV location, and for Con Ed CSRP window, which does apply here, we'll set it to an afternoon 2 to 6 p.m. window. We'll keep the rest of the inputs the same from our previous run, and let's see what the results show. Actually, I already had hit and calculate. So, on the detailed outputs tab, I'm going to scroll right to the annual compensation for export section. We can see that project exports about 1.3 million kilowatt hours of energy immediately to the grid each year, generating just over $200,000 in value. And down at the bottom of these tables, we can see that the net present value of the project is 2.26 million over 25 years. Now, let's go back to the user inputs and add some storage to the system. I'm going to add the 200 kilowatt 4-hour battery and select ICAP alternative 2. First step will be to change the project type so that instead of a solar only project, we have solar plus storage. Keep the rest of the general and solar inputs the same. Now down in the storage inputs, I have to hit calculate here. Let's see that it's no longer grayed out. and the gray cell is changed to yes. We're assuming for this battery that it can charge at up to 200 kilowatts per hour and discharge at the same rate. It's a 4-hour battery. That means the maximum capacity is 4 times 200, so 800 kilowatt hours. I'm going to make an assumption of 80% round-trip efficiency, so what's left after including losses, both charging and discharging. I'm going to have the dispatch optimize around maximizing capacity and demand reduction values, DRV. This means that we'll try to discharge the battery when we're in the ICAP and DRV windows. The other option would be to maximize the full value stack, which would also include charging and discharge behavior for energy arbitrage around the LBMP component. In this case, I'm going to leave out storage degradation. Storage degradation function requires a macro, which we'll go into in our standalone storage example, and it can improve the accuracy of our results. But I will leave it out now so we have one case without. We don't need to enter anything on the utility delivery rate because solar plus storage is not allowed to charge from the grid for the purposes of this calculator. We are going to change to capacity alternative 2 now. See how that impacts our results. And now I'm going to calculate and go back to the detailed outputs and see what's changed. So first off, I want to call out that we are previously showing just under 1.3 million kilowatt hours immediately exported to the or by the system per year. That number is now dropped closer to 1.2 million. The total compensation from immediate exports is also dropped. It was around 200,000 per year before, and now it's about 190,000. This isn't a huge shift, but we're no longer exporting everything right away, and there are some losses experienced with the battery. Scroll down. You can also see that storage compensation section has now been filled in. We're charging about 57,000 kilowatt hours a year early on from the solar, and then 46,000 kilowatt hours is later exported to the grid. The discrepancy there is from the 80% round-trip efficiency that we selected. 46,000 is about 80% of 57,000, and the remaining 20% is lost between charging and discharging. You can see a breakdown of the values that export generates, including a negative component to indicate the reduced solar compensation from not just exporting everything immediately and without losses. New total project value comes out to 241,000 per year, escalating over time, and we get a net present value of 2.66 million. This is about $400,000 more than our solar only setup. If we scroll down to the graphs, we can see these become a little bit more interesting. There's a dash green bar in the first to indicate where we're charging the battery in the morning to be used for exports later on when the capacity and demand reduction values are better. We scroll down a couple to the system energy flows. We can see where in the summer we're using the battery. with the export charges and slightly smaller, export discharge bars. The following project value graph shows us how much the compensation is coming directly from exporting solar versus the energy that's first put into storage and exported later on. So that's a picture of how the calculator can show the additional impact of adding storage. For our next example, we're going to look at a small commercial customer with behind-the-meter solar and on-site load. We'll say the customer has a 40 kilowatt solar system. It consumes around 50,000 kilowatt hours of electricity per year at 14 cents a kilowatt hour. Remember, our equation for the value provided by solar here won't just be the energy produced times the value stack, but instead the sum of the solar energy that goes to reduce consumption at the retail rate and the credits received from energy exported at the value stack rate. Already set up the user inputs in the calculator, so we'll walk through those pretty quickly. We want a solar only project. We'll set our AC interconnection limit at 5 megawatts. The system will be much smaller than this, so it won't come into play. This example is for Orange and Rockland, and we're in the NYSO Zone G. We'll keep the financial analysis specifications the same, and then we want to move down and select projects with on-site load. The solar characteristics, the nearest location is now New York City. Let's say we have a roof-mounted system. The system size will be 40 kilowatts DC, 35 AC. Since this is a project with on-site load, we could either input our own load profiles or use some of the reference profiles from the Department of Energy that the calculator has built in. We want to take advantage of those profiles, and then we'll specifically select the small office building type here. The load profile is important because we'll want to know when the customer uses energy and if it aligns with when the solar is producing. We're going to assume 50,000 kilowatt hours of use per year, and the calculator tells us that the solar will then meet about half of that load. Because the solar system covers on-site load and is within size limitations for net metering, we get a flag in red that the system could theoretically qualify for phase 1 net metering. Since this is the value stack calculator, net metering is out of scope for this analysis, but that flag is really just a heads up. We'll keep many of the same assumptions around solar degradation and scrolling down to use the 3-year LBMPs and alternative 1 capacity values. The zone down here has updated in the gray cell, and we'll keep moving on to the customer bill savings. This section, which we've left zeroed out before, is now pretty important because the presence of on-site load means there's an opportunity to offset that load and save on existing energy bills. Even though we're on the value stack and not net metering, energy that our system produces that the customer uses directly becomes bill savings at the customer's retail energy rate. Energy that the solar produces that isn't used by the customer is exported to the grid and compensated based on the value stack. Therefore, the overall value of solar is a weighted average of energy that is produced and used by the customer at the retail rate and energy that is produced and exported to the grid at the value stack rates. This is why the load profiles were important as well, because without storage, solar production has to align with load for the customer to use that energy directly. In this case, we're going to say that the retail rate is 14 cents per kilowatt hour. We'll assume that the rate increases at 2% per year. Remember that this rate should include inflation. We don't have any storage, and we'll leave that last item empty, but if we did have storage, we'd want to also include any per kilowatt demand charges in case those could be avoided by dispatching at the right time, or simply based on the customer's bill. Now let's go ahead and click calculate. I'm going to focus on the detailed output section here. You can see in the first section that between 1 and 3,000 kilowatt hours are exported in a given month each year. But then in the on-site bill reduction section, another 1,300 to 2,800 kilowatt hours are consumed on site. The compensation from the value stack in the first month of operation is $139, but we're also saving $186 on the January bill. We scroll down to the monthly total values section. You can see that the total project value is the sum of these. In this case, the numbers are just slightly different due to rounding. We scroll down to the figures section. We can see a nice picture of how energy is used in a given day. On this average August weekday, we're using almost all the energy produced during the early morning and late afternoon, but in the midday period, we export a fair amount of solar to the grid. The graph below shows a specific weekday, so the values aren't quite as smooth, but it's a similar picture. You can also scroll down to the project value by month graph, which depicts the monthly total values we had talked about. In the Summary Outputs tab, we can see that the total value of energy produced by the system, including both the value stack compensation and bill savings, starts at just under $6,000 per year. This then increases over time as both the value stack and retail rates escalate. For our last example, we'll highlight the new functionality of this revision, the ability to model standalone storage. We'll use a theoretical system in Con Edison territory and select the alternative 3 capacity choice, which is the only alternative standalone storage projects are eligible for. We'll look at the revenue charging cost, which is a new component here, and then resulting net revenue. As always, we'll start by entering the project type. This time standalone storage, and the interconnection limit, utility, and NYSERDA. The standalone storage selected, also get a red flag right away to tell us that the system is only eligible for capacity alternatives 3. Standalone storage projects also must be front of the meter to be modeled in this calculator. We don't have to worry about any of the solar inputs now, and can skip down to the storage section. We'll assume we have a 1,000 kilowatt system with a 4-hour battery, so the maximum capacity is 4,000 kilowatt hours. I'm going to just say there's an 80% round trip efficiency here, and then we'll have the system set to maximize capacity and DRV. As we discussed on the Solar Plus storage model run, the other option is to dispatch for the full value stack, which would include energy arbitrage as well. We'll model that next. I'm also going to include storage degradation, which will cause the model to recalculate optimal dispatch patterns every year of the storage lifetime. This is the recommended route with standalone storage projects to receive more accurate results, even if you were to set the annual degradation to 0. This is because if you have any escalators set for the retail rates or changes to the value stack, this can shift when the optimal charge and discharge timing would be. Without the storage degradation macro, the model will just take a simple approach and mimic the first year's dispatch pattern for each subsequent year. That said, the storage degradation macro can take a few minutes to run, so if you just want a quick, broad output and care most about the first few years of operation, you can leave this turned off. Next, we have the utility delivery rate inputs. These only matter for standalone storage, but they are very important here. You'll want to look at the customer's utility rates to make sure you have these correct. The documentation tab has some description to help with filling these out, but can't tell you exactly which rate you're on. Another thing to keep in mind is that these inputs are for the delivery rate, or the rate you're paying for power received from the utility. There can be quite a few options here, but they are at least narrowed down to standalone storage eligible rate classes. If you select a rate and then change to a utility that can't use that rate, you will see a message in red telling you that the rate is not valid, and the drop-down options will update. You can also input here any generation supply charges and an assumption for a retail rate escalator. To keep things simple, I'm going to match this escalator to the 2% value we've been using for energy and capacity. Now on to compensation. We're going to, again, leave the LSRB at none and pick the 2 to 6 p.m. CSRP window. We'll assume the DRV rate stays the same for all years, and we'll use the last 3 years LBMPs. Like I mentioned earlier, standalone storage only qualifies for alternative 3 capacity, so we'll use that, and we'll base it on prior year ICAP values. We're not going to override the grid exports in the prior year peak hour. And now I would hit calculate. However, to avoid making you wait for the storage degradation macro to cycle through 25 years of this project, I've already run this, so I'm going to skip to the results. The macro can be finicky, but typically takes between 1 and 10 minutes to run, depending on the user's computer and how many years you want it to look at. For users of the prior standalone storage calculator, we've fixed several bugs and made other improvements to the dispatch logic, but have also simplified it slightly in order to reduce run times in this combined solar calculator. If you're interested in better understanding the logic, we've included a section in the documentation tab. With that said, let's go on to the results. On the Detailed Outputs tab, looking at the monthly compensation from storage, we can see that the project is only discharging in June through September. However, the project has costs and revenues throughout the year. This is a little counterintuitive, but because the ICAP alternative 3 is selected to compensate the project based on the peak single hour of the year, rather than evaluating on a monthly basis, the project still earns capacity value throughout the year. At the same time, there is a charging cost, which ultimately comes out of the contract demand charge a system pays. Similar in a way to the capacity compensation, the contract demand charge is applied year-round, but is really tied to the peak import or export demand from the system during the year. That peak comes in the summer months, while the system is operating, but impacts bills year-round. Because of this, the project generates both revenue and costs, even in months that it does not operate. The net value from the project is negative for the first 4 months of the year. See here. And then positive for the rest, with high revenues in the summer months, making it revenue positive overall. If we look at the annual results, we can see that the value fluctuates year by year. Here, let's go down a little further. And is not simply escalated or decreasing over time. This is because with the storage degradation macro turned on, the model reevaluates the appropriate dispatch pattern to maximize revenues each year, and that will vary over time as the impact of the cost and value stack components vie against each other hour by hour. And the final net present value we see is 2.2 million. If we look down the graphs, we can see a pretty straightforward picture. Using August, when storage is operating, we can see that it will charge in the early morning and then discharge in the afternoon each day. If we scroll to the graph at the bottom, you can see a pretty straightforward picture as well. You can see graphically how the charging cost and capacity value are present throughout the year, but it's the demand reduction value in the summer months that really makes a difference for the overall value. Now, if we were to go back and change the dispatch to dispatch for the full value stack here, we'll see how that changes things. I actually have these results up in a new workbook, so we don't have to make the macro run and wait for that again. If we look at the detailed results tab, now you can see that the storage is charging and discharging through most months of the year. As a result, the energy value becomes a more significant part of the picture, though it is still less than the capacity or demand reduction value components. The net total project value is still negative in the first 4 months and positive for the rest of the year. If we jump down to the graphs, we can see the more active charging and discharging behavior illustrated, but the total project value graph hasn't changed all that much. The net present value in this scenario is not quite 2.3 million, so it has increased, but not dramatically. However, this is with a fairly significant loss in assumptions, which especially impacts the value of energy arbitrage, the added benefit here. And if we were to shift around our assumptions of how different components escalate over time, we could see different results. If we were to, say, set the DRV to drop off over time, or have retail rates and energy costs rise more rapidly, this could flip the equation. In more extreme scenarios, charging costs could supersede revenues year-round, in which case the calculator will generally curtail dispatch to avoid operating at a loss. This is why you need to give care to the input assumptions you make, but hopefully between this presentation and the documentation provided, you'll have the tools you need to start testing some projects. That's it for the model runs. Congratulations on completing the value stack calculator training. We've explored the value stack and its components and learned how to use the calculator model for a variety of project types. Thank you for watching and good luck in your future Veeder projects.